Cultural materialism. On a very basic level, cultural materialism has been equated with new historicism because both practices interpret literary texts as historical and cultural artifacts. Cultural materialism, as Jonathan Dollimore and Annel Sinfield described it in Political Shakespeare, written in 1985, it studies the implication of literary text in history, and it is therefore an historical or historicist approach to literature. If you look at the picture, you may see how illusory it is. Are you looking at the men smoking or the woman, or the woman with the jewel? So that is the kind of confusion you may have while reading New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. New Historicism is of American origin and Cultural Materialism is of a British origin. They are they share lots of concepts, at the same time they differ in their approach. Let us look at the context in which it was produced. The theory was propounded and practiced. Cultural materialism owes much to British Marxism, particularly to the Welsh critic Raymond Williams. It is also influenced by or related to the sociology of literature conferences held at Essex University from 1976 to 1984 and to the journal Literature and History founded in 1975 and edited at Thames Polytechnic from 1975 to 1988. Both the Essex conferences and literature and history were significant developments in formulating and fashioning new historical approaches to literature in Britain and made way for cultural materialism. The focus was primarily on emphasizing the importance of history as a shaping force of literary text and the importance of literary text in shaping history. The Essex conferences historicized the discipline of English literature and questioned its various self-images, its theoretical commonplaces, and its disciplinary boundaries. And literature and history extended Williams' historical and materialist approaches to culture, popular as well as high culture. Both the conferences and the journal promoted new works and formed a very important context for the emergence of cultural materialism, as Dollimore and Sinfield would explain. The breakup of consensus in British political life during 1970s was accompanied by the breakup of traditional assumptions about the values and the goals of literary criticism. Now, the breakup in political life refers to the following: the miners' strike against the income policy Edward Heath's conservative government practiced. What happened was the conservative government lost the general election in 1974, and again in 1979 the Conservative Party was voted to power with Margaret Thatcher as the first ever woman prime minister. So that is the turmoil that England experienced during 1970s. Initially, as at specialized conferences and in committed journals, increasingly in the mainstream of intellectual life, literary texts were related to new and challenging discourses of Marxism, feminism, structuralism, psychoanalysis, and post-structuralism. It is widely admitted that all this brought a new vigor and excitement to literary discussions. At the same time, it has raised profound questions about the status of literary text, both as linguistic entities and as ideological forces in our society. Out of this particular milieu, a new and challenging discourses came a materialist approach to study of culture. Culture as a word and as a concept keenly interested Raymond Williams. He debated its meaning, its application, and the history of its composition in culture and society, keywords Marxism and literature, and materialism and culture. Although Williams recognized that culture referred to intellectual development and to the arts in general, in his own practice he referred to more anthropological sense of the way of life of people. It involved their collective practices, beliefs, and social customs, political values, and the forms of expression, and is akin to the cultural system which new historicists took as their object of study. A materialist approach to culture then examined how culture was produced technologically, practically, and ideologically. Raymond Williams was by no means alone in conducting materialist analysis of culture in post-war Britain. Since 1950s, Richard Hogarth, the author of The Uses of Literacy, Aspects of Working Class Life, written in 1957, and E.P. Thompson had engineered major shifts in the direction taken by the academic disciplines of literary studies and history. Thomson was a major pioneer of social history, and his book, Making of the English Working Class, brought a materialist conception of class identity to bear on the study of history. Williams and Hogarth were responsible for creating cultural studies, a discipline formed from literary studies, anthropology, and sociology, and were also responsible for making culture as much the object of literary study as literature. Williams argued that literature was not autonomous. He says we cannot separate literature and art from other kinds of social practice in such a way as to make them subject to quite special and distinct laws. The theoretical affiliation which we need to understand is structures of feelings as promoted by Raymond Williams. Cultural studies could also be understood as literatures viewed from the below, the periphery. Cultural materialism takes a good deal of its outlook and its name from Raymond Williams. Instead of Foucault's notion of discourse, Williams invented the term structures of feeling. These are concerned with the meanings and values as they are lived and felt. Structures of feelings are often antagonistic both to explicit systems of values and beliefs and to the dominant ideologies within a society. They are characteristically found in literature, and they oppose the status quo as the values found in Dickens and Bronte's represent human structures of feeling which are at variance with Victorian commercial and materialistic values. The result is that cultural materialism is much more optimistic about the possibility of change and is willing at times to see literature as a source of oppositional values. Cultural materialism particularly involves using the past to read the present, revealing the politics of our own society by what we choose to emphasize or suppress of the past. For example, Oliver Twist is a story about poor people in England who got unfair treatment from the society. Dickens describes the poor condition suffered by people, especially children, during Victorian era. Many people unlucky children during the Victorian period were born and then sent to the workhouses. The novel criticizes the social injustice, social inequality, and discrimination. The social injustice disparity is pictured within the characters' occupation, the way of their dressing, material wealth, obesity, the authority, and the living environments. Another example could be Jane Eyre's Mad Woman in the Attic. Bertha Mason is a mad woman in the attic, as referred to, and her act of setting fire is a step towards oppositional values that you can see during the novels written during Victorian England. A great deal of British work has been about undermining what it sees as the fetishistic role of Shakespeare as a conservative icon within British culture. This form of cultural materialism can be conveniently sampled in three new accents books: The Shakespeare Myth, Graham Holderness; Alternative Shakespeare, edited by John Drekes; and That Shakespearean Rag, Terence Hawkes. These are some of the titles that might interest the readers of cultural materialism. Cultural materialism is a politicized form of historiography as it is defined by Graham Holderness. It is the study of historical material within a politicized framework. Though Raymond Williams coined the term cultural materialism, Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield made it current and defined cultural materialism as designating a critical method which has four characteristics. Number one, historical context. What was happening at the time the text was written? Historical context undermines the transcendent significance traditionally accorded to the literary text, and the aim of this aspect of cultural materialism is to allow the literary text to recover its histories, which previous kinds of study have often ignored. They say that emphasis on historical context suggests that timeless value cannot be accorded to a canonical text. Number two, theoretical method. Cultural materialism incorporates older methods of theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, etc. They absorb lessons from them and break away from liberal humanism. Third one, political commitment. Incorporating non-conservative, non-Christian frameworks such as feminism and Marxist theory is what is meant by political commitment here. The influence of Marxist and feminist perspectives are accepted, and the break from conservative Christian framework is initiated in their discussion. Number four, textual analysis. The stress on textual analysis locates the critique of traditional approaches where it cannot be ignored. In other words, there is a commitment not just to making theory of an abstract kind, but to practicing it on canonical text, which continue to be the focus of academic and professional attention and which are prominent national and cultural icons. Some of the characteristics of cultural materialism. Culture is referred to all forms of culture, forms like television and popular music and fiction. It goes beyond the high cultural forms like Shakespeare plays. Materialism signifies the opposite of idealism. An idealist belief would be that high culture represents the free and independent play of the talented individual mind. On the contrary, materialist belief is that culture cannot transcend the material forces and relations of production. Culture is not simply a reflection of economic and political system, but nor can it be independent of it. It is an emphasis on the functioning of the institutions through which Shakespeare is brought to us. If new historicism derives from Foucault's discourse, cultural materialism derives from structures of feeling. These are concerned with the meanings and oppositional values as they are lived and felt, as I referred to earlier. Cultural materialism particularly involves using the past to read the present, revealing the politics of our own society by what we choose to emphasize or to suppress the past. A great deal of British work undermines the role of Shakespeare as conservative icon within British culture. And what is the difference between new historicism and cultural materialism? The major difference is that new historicists tend to concentrate on those at the top of the social hierarchy, the church, the monarchy, and the upper classes, while cultural materialists tend to concentrate on those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, the lower classes, women, and other marginalized people. Cultural materialists see new historicists as politically ineffective or unable to produce change because they do not believe in absolute truth or absolute knowledge. Therefore, they must not believe in the truth of what they write. New historicists defend themselves by saying that they do not believe in the truth of their own work, but they write with the full awareness of the difficulties, contradictions, limitations, and problems of trying or claiming to establish truth. New historicists focus on the oppositional and oppressive aspects of society that people have to overcome to achieve change. Cultural materialists focus on how that change is wrought. So, new historicists are pessimists and cultural materialists are optimists. Cultural materialism uses co-text from the entire trajectory of a text history, whereas new historicism uses only co-text that would have been contemporary to the text in question. This is the key difference between cultural materialism and the new historicism. The new historicist situates the literary text in the political situation of its own day, while the cultural materialist situates it within that of ours. Cultural materialists see new historicists as cutting themselves off from effective political positions by their acceptance of a particular version of post-structuralism, with its radical skepticism about the possibility of attaining secure knowledge. When new historicists claim that Foucault gives them entry into a non-truth oriented form of historicist study of text. The differences lie mainly in two aspects. Firstly, in the political outlook, and secondly, in the degree of emphasis on the post-structuralist perspective. For example, a skeptic about both approaches would suggest that it must be hard for any new historicist to explain how the English Civil War ever got started, since they seem to envisage a pervasive state power which would make resistance virtually impossible. While for the cultural materialist, it must be difficult to explain how it ever ended, since their structures of feeling constantly threw up new ideas which would seem to make stasis impossible. Now, coming to an illustration from Othello, if you take cultural materialism, Othello, and the politics of plausibility written by Alan Sinfield in the year 1992, it would be clear. If you read the play Othello, you will understand that it is very clearly stated that Iago's stories, discourse, his discourse, works not because he is cunning, but because his lies perfectly mirror the presumptions, assumptions, and prejudices of a Venetian culture that sees blacks as exotic, inferior to whites, ignorant, barbaric, and prone to revert to type. Another post-colonial critic, Anya Lumba, would say Vathala moves from being a colonized subject existing on the terms of Venetian culture and trying to internalize its ideology towards being marginalized, outcast, and alienated from it in every way until he occupies his position as its other. Even Vathala resigns himself to this perception of himself because he is engulfed by the overpowering ideology of Venice's political, economic, and cultural elite, a society that uses him for his prowess as a general, yet he is unwilling to include him as a member in a good standing of its in crowd. As Althusser would put it, Vathala is interpolated or interpellated or given an identity by the state as a savage, and he eventually answers its powerful call. Iago's stratagems work not because of his ingenuity, but because his lies are plausible, sensible to the Venetians, and even tragically to Othello himself. Sinfield refers to the underlying cultural material that Iago exploits and of which Othello is a victim as politics of plausibility. The very same essay you can see Alan Sinfield argues for the production of ideology. He notes that societies must produce ideologies that will maintain production of great many things. Not only do societies need to produce food, energy, and goods to trade, they also need to produce understandings of a system of social relationships that keep the whole process producing everything from pork bellies to political systems. Ideological potency arises from its ability to make what is happening around us seem like a plausible account, believable story. It is a discourse. Potent ideology is that which produces the greatest degree of plausibility. Although ideology is produced at all points of cultural spectrum, nowhere is it more powerful than in the stories or discourses of its powerful elite. The discourse of the elite sound more plausible than explanations or stories of those who have been marginalized, as Vadallo has. Stories of marginalized sound very suspicious, while the discourses of those who speak within the ideological wheelhouse of the power base and about everyone but Vadallo sound uncannily reasonable, obvious, and full of common sense. Sinfield suggests that Vadallo kills himself because he cannot reconcile his barbaric nature by Venetian standards with the ideal of the civilized man. Venice purports to produce, remember, Vathala himself is tragically made to believe that prevailing ideology of the Venetian state he serves like a magnificent slave. Another point made by Sinfield is Desdemona's defiance, as pictured by him, is referring to entrapment model. Sinfield considers the entrapment model as Desdemona answers her father when he attempts to exert hegemony as a dominating parent and intimidating member of the city's powerful elite. He asks Brabantio, asks her, do you perceive in all this noble company? There you can see the intimidation. The language that is being used here is an intimidation. Where most you owe your obedience, there again dominance is indicated. So the language of intimidation and dominance is employed by Brabantio over women, the marginalized. This is where the textual analysis is also very important in cultural materialism as well as new historicism. She cleverly uses the embedded conflict and the dissidents that are hidden within the social orders that control her. By doing so, Desdemona gains some control from her father and from the political structure of Venice. She answers that she owes her allegiance to her husband, namely Othello, just as her own mother owes her allegiance to her husband, Brabantio, namely Desdemona's father. The subtle defiance works because she, ex- she expertly exploits the potential for dissidence within the ideology produced by and for the social structures in which she was born, lives, and will die. Desdemona's story is plausible, whereas Othello is not able to produce ideology or discourse. That is the difference between the power and the marginalized, the colonized and the colonizer. Sinfield again quotes another example, queer theatre, as an example for dissident strategy. One component of dissident strategy is to denaturalize, as evidenced in the discussion of Gay Gabel Row, alternative family values, and gender defenders, and Mickey Fast Club, and even in queer theatre. These are all some of the examples that you may have it for dissident strategy. Sinfield questions what the best dissident strategies might be. He himself writes, no strategy emerges as the magical answer. The task is not to specify the one true strategy, but to be flexible and cunning as dominant ideologies are. Sinfield holds that textual analysis readily demonstrates dissidence being incorporated into existing structures because it operates in direct reference to dominate structures. Sinfield uses dissident instead of subversive because although dissident appears at first glance to be weaker of the two terms, it is actually stronger because it is more likely to avoid the entrapment model as noted above. He implores the text of the traditional canon and the production of those texts be explored in terms of the political and social elements at play when they were written, noting that the more persuasive the writing, the greater its potential for political intervention. Sinfield concludes his essay by stating a cultural materialist practice will review the institutions that retell the Shakespeare stories and will attempt also self-consciousness about its own situation within those institutions. We need not just to produce different readings, but to shift the criteria of plausibility. Referring to Shakespeare's Tempest, again Greenblatt would say that if It is the task of cultural criticism or materialism to decipher the power of Prospero. It is also the task to hear the pronouncement of Caliban. The critic's job is to notice that contradictory elements, namely dissidents of the author's world, are being juxtaposed in the author's work to bring to light significant conflict and make statements about the world. In this kind of reading, Prospero represents the imperialism of European exploration of the New World, and the Caliban, the right of the people of the New World to self-determination. Therefore, self-fashioning occurs at the point of encounter between an authority and an alien, and what is produced in this encounter partakes of both, and any achieved identity always contains within itself the signs of its own subversion or loss. To end this lecture, a quotation on Shakespeare plays is worth reading, given by Dollymore and Sinfield. A play by Shakespeare is related to the context of its production, to the economic and political system of Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and to the particular institutions of cultural production. Moreover, the relevant history is not just of 400 years ago, for culture is made continuously, and Shakespeare's text is reconstructed, reappraised, reassigned all the time through diverse institutions in specific context. This is what Dollymore and Sinfield has written in their introduction to Political Shakespeare, New Essays in Cultural Materialism. So these are some of the points that you might have it in your mind for understanding of New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. Both these schools of thinking share quite many theoretical affiliations and at the same time differ in a very subtle manner only to project their own political outlook and theoretical perspectives. These are some of the references you can have it for your reading. Thank you very much and wish you all the best.